Twin brothers went missing in 1984. Then, a photograph was found inside a church organ. The dust of nearly 40 years, a fine sepulchral powder, puffed from the sealed compartment as the workman, oblivious to the gravity of his find, pried it open with a grunt, the wood groaning in protest after decades of silence. Inside, nestled amongst forgotten tuning tools, a desiccated mouse corpse, and the brittle skeletal remains of ancient spiders, lay a single Polaroid photograph, its colors muted by time, but its image terrifyingly clear, a photograph of the twin boys, Thomas and Arthur, their faces thinner, their eyes haunted, taken years, it seemed, after they had walked away from Sunday school, from their mother's waiting embrace, from everything known, and into the chilling embrace of an unending mystery. A mystery that had hollowed out the heart of a small town and the soul of a woman who never stopped looking towards the river. Behind them in the photograph, an ominous presence, stood a robed figure, its form indistinct, its face entirely, deliberately, obliterated by a thick, vicious smear of black ink. A void where a human countenance should have been, a horrifying negation. The workman, a young man named Liam, with no connection to the sorrows of 1984, merely whistled, thinking it an odd forgotten relic, perhaps a prank from choir boys long grown, and set it aside on a dusty pew, the image of the two lost boys staring up at the vaulted, indifferent ceiling of St. Michael's, the church that was finally, after so much debate and dwindling congregation, undergoing its painful, necessary renovations. It was only later, when the site foreman, a man old enough to remember the faces on the missing posters that had once papered every shop window and lamppost, picked it up, his hand trembling, that the air in the church grew colder, the sunlight through the stained glass windows suddenly seeming accusatory, the silence no longer peaceful but laden with the unspeakable. He knew those faces. Every one of a certain age knew those faces. Thomas and Arthur, the Finch twins, vanished as if the earth had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only two small, identical blue coats found neatly folded by the frost-rimmed banks of the River Thorn. A discovery that had offered a swift, cruel narrative of accidental drowning, a narrative the town had clung to, a narrative their mother, Sarah, had fought against with every fiber of her being for 39 agonizing years. The organ, a colossal, Baroque monstrosity of pipes and bellows, had been silent for the last decade, its last organist, the reclusive and unsettling Mr. Alistair Finch, no relation to the boys. A cruel coincidence of nomenclature that had always felt like a thorn, having died under a cloud of hushed investigation in 1992. His demise officially ruled a heart attack, though whispers of other, darker reasons had never quite faded, especially among those who remembered his peculiar intensity, his almost proprietary relationship with the instrument that dominated the church's western gallery. Now, this photograph, a silent testament from a sealed tomb within the organ itself, screamed a different story, a story of survival beyond that cold November day, a story of captivity, of a horror protracted and unseen. The foreman felt the blood drain from his face. He had to call Sarah, or perhaps, he thought, his stomach churning, he had to call the police first. The weight of the small square piece of cardboard in his hand was immense, a burden of decades, a key to a lock no one had dared to hope might ever turn. The ink-blotted face loomed in his mind, a faceless specter that had somehow, impossibly, held the boys in its thrall, long after the river was supposed to have claimed them. The organ pipes, stripped and catalogued, lay like felled giants on the tarpaulin-covered floor, their mouths agape, as if they too were about to speak of secrets kept too long in the dark. Resonant chambers of wood and metal. The discovery was a rupture, a violent tearing of the thin scar tissue that had formed over a wound that had never truly healed, for Sarah, for the town, for the very stones of St. Michael's itself. The past was not only unburied, It was alive, and it was pointing a damning spectral finger from the heart of the house of God. The scent of old incense and decay, always present in St. Michael's, now seemed to carry a more sinister metallic tang, the smell of fear, of ancient secrets, of innocence lost not to the indifferent current of a river, but to something far more calculating, far more monstrous. The foreman looked again at the photo, at the boy's eyes. They were not the eyes of children who had merely wandered off. They were the eyes of children who had seen too much, endured too much. And the robed figure behind them, even without a face, radiated a chilling authority, a possessive darkness that felt utterly, terrifyingly absolute. The silence of the church pressed in, no longer a holy quiet, but the quiet of a crime scene, undisturbed for far too long. Sarah had learned to live in a world rendered in shades of gray, the vibrant colors of her life having bled out on that cold November afternoon in 1984, when her 8-year-old twin sons, Thomas and Arthur, failed to return from Sunday school. Their laughter, the echo of their small feet on the wooden porch, the way they argued over whose turn it was to hold her hand, these were memories preserved in amber, precious and agonizingly sharp. The official story, the one the police had settled on after weeks of fruitless searching turned into months, then years, was that the boys, drawn by the allure of the swollen River Thorn, had slipped on the muddy bank and been swept away. Their identical blue coats, found neatly folded side by side, were presented as tragic, final evidence. But for Sarah, this explanation was a shroud too easily thrown over a void too vast. How could two boys, so inseparable, so cautious after her repeated warnings about the river, both fall in? And why the folded coats? It was a detail too neat, too tidy for a frantic accident. It felt staged, a cruel misdirection. She had voiced these doubts, her voice raw with grief and a desperate, intuitive certainty. But they had been met with sympathetic nods and gentle reassurances that grief could make the mind see shadows where there were none. So she had carried her dissent like a hidden stone, heavy in her heart, while the town slowly moved on, the missing posters fading and tearing in the wind, eventually disappearing altogether, replaced by notices for summer fetes and council meetings. She never moved from the small house with the porch they'd last skipped down. She kept their room as they had left it, a shrine of arrested childhood, model airplanes gathering dust on the windowsill, crayon drawings taped to the wall, a pair of muddy boots still standing by the door, waiting for feet that never returned. Every year on their birthday she baked a cake, lit the candles, and sang to an empty room, her voice cracking, the silence afterwards a deafening roar of their absence. She had become a fixture in the town, the grieving mother, a woman etched with sorrow, her eyes perpetually scanning crowds for too familiar faces, even as those faces would now be men in their late 40s. Hope, that tenacious, cruel little bird, had never entirely flown away. It fluttered weakly in the cage of her ribs, a painful reminder of what was lost, what might, against all odds, still be found. The church, St. Michael's, had been a place of complex emotions for her. It was where they had last been seen, innocent and alive, their small hands clutching Bible storybooks. But it was also the domain of Mr. Alistair Finch, the organist, a man whose quiet intensity and oddly piercing gaze had always unsettled her, even before the boys vanished. He had offered his condolences, of course, his voice a low, resonant hum like his organ's deeper pipes, but his eyes, she remembered, had been hard to read, holding something back. A flicker of something she couldn't name, but which chilled her nonetheless. His death in 1992, during a renewed, albeit brief, police inquiry into cold cases, had brought a strange, almost guilty sense of relief, quickly suppressed. There had been no evidence linking him to anything, just an old woman's unease, easily dismissed. Now, nearly 4 decades on, the call from Mark Jennings, the foreman, a man she'd known since he was a boy himself, delivering newspapers to her door, shattered the fragile equilibrium she had painstakingly built. A photograph, found in the organ, of Thomas and Arthur. Her heart, that tired, scarred muscle, seemed to stop, then hammer against her ribs with a force that stole her breath. The organ, Alistair Finch's domain. The details Liam had relayed were sparse, confused, but the core of it, the boys, alive, years after they were presumed dead, with a robed, faceless figure, ignited a maelstrom of terror and a wild, unbearable hope. The river had been a lie. She had always known it. The folded coats were a lie. Her intuition, dismissed as the ramblings of a bereaved mother, had been a desperate whisper of the truth. The world tilted. The grays of her existence suddenly shot through with a horrifying, vivid color, the color of a nightmare made real. She had to see it. She had to see their faces, even if it broke her all over again. The journey to St. Provost. Michael's was a blur, the familiar streets of the town suddenly alien, overlaid with the ghosts of 1984, with the image of two small boys walking hand in hand. Unaware of the shadow that was about to engulf them, the church loomed, its stone facade more imposing, more sinister than she had ever perceived it. This place, which should have been a sanctuary, now felt like the entrance to a crypt that had held her son's fate sealed within its musical heart for decades. The photograph lay on a makeshift table in the church vestry, a small, square portal to an unimaginable past. Sarah approached it slowly, her legs unsteady. The foreman, Mark, and a young, solemn-faced police officer, Detective Miller, watching her with a mixture of pity and apprehension. The Polaroid was faded, its once vibrant colors now muted, sepia-toned like a relic from an even earlier era, yet the images were stark, undeniable. There they were, Thomas and Arthur. Older, perhaps 10 or 11, their faces pale, their eyes wide and dark, pools of a knowledge no child should possess. They were thinner than she remembered, the playful roundness of their 8-year-old cheeks gone, replaced by a fragile angularity. They wore simple, dark clothing, unfamiliar to her. And behind them, the figure, tall, draped in what looked like a dark, heavy robe, possibly clerical or ceremonial, its details obscured by the poor lighting and the age of the photograph. But the face, or rather, the lack of it, was the epicenter of the horror. A deliberate, vicious smear of black ink, thick and absolute, eradicating any feature, any identity, leaving only a terrifying, humanoid void. It was an act of profound malice, a statement of power and concealment. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, a strangled sob. It was them, her boys. Alive, years after the river. Years of captivity, years of, what? Her mind recoiled from the possibilities, the abyss of suffering that opened before her. The photograph was dated faintly on the back, in spidery, faded ink. November 1986. 2 years. 2 years they had been alive, somewhere, with this thing. Where was this taken? She whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. Detective Miller cleared his throat. We don't know, Mrs. Finch. The background is indistinct. It appears to be indoors, perhaps a cellar or a basement. The lighting is poor. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The compartment it was found in, it was part of the organ's original housing, sealed off during a previous repair, we think sometime in the late 80s or very early 90s, before Mr. Finch passed away. Alistair Finch. The name hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. The organist. The man with the unsettling eyes. The man who had died while the police were, however, tentatively looking again at the boy's disappearance. He was questioned back then, wasn't he? Sarah asked, her gaze fixed on the photograph, on the dark smear where a face should be. In 92? Detective Miller, too young to have been involved then, consulted a thin file he carried. Briefly, Mr. Alistair Finch. He was the organist here from 1975 until his death. He was reclusive. There were some reports from parishioners about him being somewhat stern with choir boys, but nothing substantiated. He denied any knowledge of the twins' disappearance. He had an alibi for the day they went missing, said he was practicing in the church all afternoon alone. Alone, in the church, with the organ. Sarah felt a cold dread seep into her bones. The organ, not just an instrument, but a potential hiding place, a silent witness, its vast network of pipes and chambers like a labyrinth. The foreman, Mark, spoke up, his voice hushed. When we started dismantling it, we found odd things. Not just this. He gestured to the photo. Some of the access panels to the bellows chamber, they were modified. Hinges on the inside, strange. And the compartment this was in, it wasn't on any of the original schematics we have for the organ. It looked like it was added later, crudely. Modified. Added. Secrets built into the very structure of the instrument Alistair Finch had commanded. His house, Sarah said, a sudden urgency in her voice. Was it searched properly when he died? Miller looked uncomfortable. It was a different time, Mrs. Finch. His death was ruled natural causes. A cursory search for a will, next of kin, he had none. His belongings were disposed of, the house sold. Disposed of, like her son's had been. The thought was a fresh stab of pain. But then, a flicker. He kept journals, Sarah said, more a statement than a question, a memory surfacing from the haze of those early years of frantic searching, of clutching at any straw. Someone, a former choir member perhaps, had mentioned Finch's meticulous, almost obsessive journaling. Old Mr. WWWWW. Abernathy, who used to clean the church, he said Finch was always writing in these little black books. Miller's eyebrows rose. Journals? That wasn't in any of the old files. A new thread, thin and fragile, but a thread nonetheless. If Alistair Finch had documented his life, his thoughts, his secrets, those journals could be the key to unlocking the horror in that faded Polaroid. The search for them would be another needle in a haystack, but now, with the concrete, terrifying evidence of the photograph, there was a renewed impetus, a grim determination. The boys had not simply vanished into the river. They had been taken, they had been held, and the man who played sacred music in the house of God was inextricably, terrifyingly linked to their fate. The blacked-out face in the photograph seemed to mock her, a symbol of the darkness that had stolen her children, a darkness that had resided, perhaps for years, within the hallowed walls of St. Michael's, its tendrils reaching out from the very heart of its music. The musty air of the vestry felt suffocating. She needed to breathe, but the air outside, the air of the ordinary world, suddenly felt like a lie, a thin veneer over a monstrous reality. The truth was here, in this church, in this photograph, in the memory of a dead organist and his secret books. The search for Alistair Finch's journals became a quiet obsession, a counterpoint to the more public, renewed police investigation that the photograph had inevitably triggered. While detectives re-interviewed aging parishioners, former choir members, and anyone who might have known Finch, Sarah, with Detective Miller's hesitant blessing, embarked on a parallel quest, a journey into the ephemera of a dead man's life. Finch had no known relatives. His house, sold decades ago, had passed through several owners. The current occupants, a young family new to the town, knew nothing of its previous, reclusive inhabitant. His personal effects, deemed of no value, had likely been auctioned off, donated to charity, or simply thrown away by the solicitor who handled his estate. It felt like another dead end, another wall of time and indifference. Yet, Sarah persisted, driven by the image of her son's captive faces. She visited antique shops, charity stores, and second-hand booksellers within a 50-mile radius, her tired voice asking the same question. Do you remember handling items from an estate sale around 1992? Specifically, any old notebooks, diaries, black-covered journals? Most shop owners offered sympathetic but unhelpful shrugs. Decades had passed. Records were sparse, memories faded. The sheer volume of forgotten lives that passed through such places was overwhelming. But Sarah clung to the detail old Mr. Abernathy had provided: little black books. It was specific enough to ignite a tiny spark of hope. She imagined Finch, his stern face bent over these books, meticulously recording, what? His mundane daily routines, or something far more sinister. The organ itself, now fully dismantled, its pipes laid out in the church nave like metallic corpses, offered no more immediate clues. Forensics teams had scoured the area where it once stood, the newly discovered compartment, the modified access panels. They found dust, cobwebs, the residue of time, but little else of evidentiary value. The photograph remained the sole stark piece of new evidence. It was displayed on news reports, the boys' faces hauntingly familiar, the blacked-out figure a source of national speculation. Theories abounded: a cult, a lone predator, a conspiracy of silence. For Sarah, the speculation was noise. The truth, she felt, lay with Finch, with the secrets he had confided to his little black books. One rainy afternoon, in a cramped, dusty antique bookstore in a neighboring town, a place smelling of decaying paper and forgotten stories, her perseverance yielded a fragile breakthrough. The elderly proprietor, a man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, listened to her inquiry, his head tilted. "Finch, you say? Alistair Finch? The name, it rings a faint bell." 1992, a solicitor clearing out a house. Yes, there were books, lots of sheet music, theological texts, and some notebooks. Black, I think. We didn't keep them long, nobody wanted them. Looked like personal ledgers, very dry. Sarah's heart leaped. "Do you remember where they went?" The bookseller stroked his chin. "Most likely bundled up with other unsellable items, sent to a bulk paper recycler, or, wait." He squinted, his mind reaching back. There was a local historian, a chap named Peterson, very keen on anything related to local church history, no matter how trivial. He used to come in, buy odd lots. He passed away some years back, but his collection, I believe it was donated to the county archives. The county archives. Another labyrinth of bureaucracy and stored history, but a concrete lead. Detective Miller, when informed, managed to cut through some of the red tape. The Peterson collection was vast, poorly catalogued, a lifetime of accumulated papers, pamphlets, and books stored in dozens of gray archival boxes. It took days of sifting, Sarah and Miller working side by side amidst the hushed silence of the archive's reading room, the smell of old paper, a constant presence. And then, in a box labeled St. Michael's Parish, Miscellaneous Ephemera, Miller pulled out a slim, black, cloth-bound notebook. Its cover was worn, the corners softened with age. Inside, the handwriting was small, cramped, meticulously neat. The first entry was dated, January honest, 1980. They had found one. Over the next few hours, they unearthed 3 more, identical in appearance, covering the years leading up to and beyond the boy's disappearance. Right up until a few weeks before Finch's death in 1992, Sarah's hands trembled as she held them. These unassuming volumes held the potential to confirm her deepest fears or, perhaps, offer a different, less monstrous explanation. Unlikely, she thought, the image of the blacked-out face seared into her mind. The initial entries were mundane: notes on choir practice, organ maintenance schedules, observations on sermons, weather patterns. Finch's prose was dry, emotionless, almost robotic. But as they moved into the period around November 1984, the entries became subtly different, shorter, more cryptic. There were references to the new responsibilities, the necessary arrangements, the silence required for the deeper work. No mention of the twins by name, nothing overt. But a chilling undercurrent began to emerge, a sense of a hidden life running parallel to his public duties as church organist. One entry from December 1984 read simply, "The river offered a convenient narrative, Providence in its way." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The folded coats. The official story, a convenient narrative. Finch had known. He had, at the very least, known the drowning story was false. The journals were not just diaries. They were the chronicles of a dark secret penned by the man who held the key, its words veiled in euphemism and oblique references, but pointing, undeniably, towards a truth far more terrible than a simple accident by a winter river. The deciphering of Alistair Finch's journals became a painstaking process, each cryptic phrase a potential key, each oblique reference a shadow pointing towards an unseen horror. Detective Miller brought in a retired cryptanalyst, a quiet woman named Eleanor, who had once worked for Signals Intelligence and possessed a mind uniquely attuned to patterns and hidden meanings. Sarah, though her presence was not official, was allowed to be privy to their progress, her intimate knowledge of the town's history and its people, sometimes providing crucial context. Finch, it became clear, was a man of intricate, almost ritualistic habits, and his journals reflected this. He never wrote directly about the boys, never used their names. Instead, he referred to them with coded terms: the young guests, the Harmonium Project, or simply the responsibilities. The entries around the time of the photograph, November 1986, were particularly chilling. One read, "The Harmonium Project progresses, their voices are adapting, though resistance remains. Patience is paramount. The documentation is necessary for the record, should the arrangement be questioned by higher authorities." Documentation, the photograph, higher authorities. Miller mused. Who could he mean? Sarah thought of the robed figure, the blacked-out face. Was Finch acting alone, or was he part of something larger, something that required him to keep records, to prove his compliance? The journals hinted at modifications to the organ, not for musical improvement, but for other purposes. "The pipes are not merely for sound," one entry stated. "Some conduct a different kind of resonance, a necessary silence." Another mentioned the chamber below the bellows, a space Finch referred to as the quiet room. "There is no such chamber in any of the church plans or the organ schematics we have," Miller said, frowning. Not officially, anyway. The image of the organ, that once majestic instrument, shifted in Sarah's mind. It was no longer just a source of music, but a complex machine with hidden compartments, secret spaces, its pipes perhaps conduits for more than just air and sound. Could it have been a cage? A prison built into the very heart of the church. The thought was monstrous, almost beyond comprehension. The robed figure in the photograph remained a terrifying enigma. Finch never mentioned an accomplice directly, but some entries alluded to visitations and inspections. "The overseer is pleased with the progress," he wrote once in 1987. "The sanctity of the work is affirmed." The overseer. Was this the figure in the photograph? Was Finch merely a custodian, a functionary in a larger, darker enterprise? The blacked-out face in the photo seemed to suggest a desire to protect an identity, or perhaps Finch himself had been forced to obscure it, a detail he dared not commit to his otherwise meticulous records. Eleanor, the cryptanalyst, pointed out recurring phrases, almost like a private liturgy, Finch used when referring to the work. Phrases like the purification of sound, the preservation of innocence, the concord of the unseen choir. It sounded like the ramblings of a deranged mind, yet there was a chilling internal logic to it. A twisted theology Finch had constructed around his actions. He believed he was doing something righteous, Eleanor said softly, her face grim. In his own distorted way, he saw this as a sacred duty. Sarah felt a wave of nausea. Righteous? Sacred? This perversion of faith, enacted upon her innocent children in the supposed sanctuary of a church. The pain was a physical blow. The journals also chronicled the boy's slow deterioration, not physically, but spiritually. Resistance is fading, Finch wrote in early 1988. The young guests are becoming more attuned to the silence. The old world recedes. It was a chilling account of psychological erosion, of two bright spirits being systematically dimmed. What happened after that? The journals continued, but references to the young guests became less frequent, more abstract, eventually ceasing altogether by late 1989. The final entries, from 1990 up to his death in 1992, were filled with increasingly paranoid ramblings, mentions of betrayal, and the structure becoming compromised. Had his overseer abandoned him, or had something gone terribly wrong with his harmonium project? The last coherent entry, just weeks before his heart attack during the police questioning, read, "The silence must be absolute. The pipes will hold their secrets eternally. They will never know the true harmony. They, the police, the world, Sarah." The ambiguity was maddening. The journals provided a horrifying glimpse into Finch's mind and the boy's protracted ordeal, but the ultimate fate, the final act in this hidden tragedy, remained shrouded. The photograph proved they had lived beyond 1984. The journals confirmed their captivity and Finch's role. But where did it end? And who was the faceless figure who shared his guilt? The church, St. Biblis. Michael's, even in its state of partial demolition and renovation, felt heavy with their presence, with their lost years. The silence Finch had craved now seemed to scream from its very stones. The cryptic clues in Alistair Finch's journals, particularly the references to the chamber below the bellows and pipes that conduct a different kind of resonance, a necessary silence, spurred a new, more invasive search of the area where the massive organ had once stood. The initial forensic sweep had been thorough, but focused on the obvious. Now, armed with Finch's own words, the investigators, led by Detective Miller and guided by the church's oldest architectural plans cross-referenced with the organ schematics, began to look for anomalies, for spaces that shouldn't exist. The church nave was a scene of orderly chaos, tools and equipment laid out, sections roped off. The air hummed with a grim, focused energy. Sarah watched from a distance, seated on a solitary wooden chair near the altar, a silent, sorrowful sentinel. Each thud of a hammer, each scrape of a trowel against stone, resonated deep within her. The main bellows of the old organ had been housed in a shallow pit beneath the choir gallery, a space accessible through a trapdoor that had been well known. But Finch's journals hinted at something deeper, something hidden. The quiet room, he'd called it. One of the older renovation crew members, a man named George, who had worked on St. Michael's sporadically for 50 years, recalled a peculiarity. There was always a section of the floor beneath the old organ console, just behind where the main bellows pit ended, that sounded hollow. We thought it was just poor foundations, an echo, never thought to look closer. It wasn't on any plans we ever saw. Following George's direction, the team focused on a specific area of the stone flagging. Tapping with rubber mallets, they listened intently. In one section, the sound was distinctly different, less solid, more resonant. Hope and dread warred in Sarah's chest. This could be it, the place where the photograph was taken. The place where her sons had been held. The workmen carefully began to lift the heavy flagstones, their edges worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Beneath them was not solid earth or foundation, but a dark, gaping void, a rough-hewn opening, just large enough for a person to slip through, leading down into blackness. A wave of cold, fetid air rose from the opening, carrying the scent of damp earth, decay, and something else, something indescribably sorrowful. Miller shone a powerful flashlight down into the void. It revealed a small, crudely excavated chamber, no more than 10 feet square and barely high enough for a man to stand upright. The walls were damp earth and rough stone, the ceiling the underside of the church floor. It was a cellar, a tomb, hidden beneath the very heart of the church's music. Finch's quiet room, Miller breathed, his voice tight. Sarah felt her vision tunnel. This was it. The place from her nightmares, the place her sons had endured. Carefully, a forensic officer, equipped with a harness and breathing apparatus, was lowered into the chamber. The silence in the church was absolute, broken only by the officer's muffled movements and the whir of his recording equipment. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, his voice, distorted by the mask, crackled over the radio. "There's something down here. Carvings on the wall. And, oh God." A pause, heavy with unspoken horror. "I found children's belongings. 2 small identical wooden toy soldiers, a child's drawing of a sun, and I think you need to come down here, detective." Sarah closed her eyes, a silent tear tracing a path down her cheek. She didn't need to hear more. She knew. Her boys had been here. This was their prison. Later, Miller, his face pale and etched with a profound sadness, would describe the scene to her, shielding her from the worst of it. The chamber was exactly as Finch's journals implied, a place of confinement. The carvings on the earthen walls were simple, childlike initials, T.F. and A.F. Thomas Finch. Arthur Finch. Scratched over and over again, a desperate assertion of identity in the oppressive darkness. There were also 2 shallow indentations in the earth, almost like small makeshift beds. And in a far corner, buried beneath a thin layer of soil, they found them. Not the boys themselves, the journals had hinted, and the lack of remains confirmed, that their bodies were not here. But they found a small locked metal box. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 2 more Polaroid photographs, even more disturbing than the first. One showed the boys, slightly older still, perhaps 12 or 13, their eyes vacant, their faces gaunt, standing before a section of what looked like organ pipes. But these pipes were different. Larger, set into a wall, almost like a ventilation system. The other photo was of Finch himself, standing in the same chamber, but this time he was not alone. Beside him stood another robed figure, its face also obscured, but not by ink. This figure wore a bizarre, bird-like ceremonial mask, ornate and terrifying. The overseer, perhaps. The one Finch had answered to. The higher authority. The box also contained a final, chilling letter, penned in Finch's neat script, addressed to no one, or perhaps to posterity, or to God. It spoke of the final harmony, of the voices joining the eternal choir, and a cryptic reference to the silent conduits ensuring their passage. It was a confession, veiled in his mad theology, of how he had ended their lives, not here in this terrible room, but somewhere else, using the silent conduits, perhaps those strange, modified pipes, to dispose of their remains, to ensure they were never found. The river had been a lie, but it had, in a twisted way, claimed them after all, their ashes or remains, possibly carried away through hidden channels leading from the church's underbelly to unknown outlets. The exact method, the final resting place, remained a horrifying unknown, but their murder at Finch's hands, likely with the involvement of the masked figure, was now a certainty. The necessary silence he wrote of was the silence of death. The revelation of the hidden chamber and its contents, particularly Finch's final, chilling letter, sent a fresh wave of shock and grief through the town and through Sarah. The not knowing had been a torment for nearly 40 years, a landscape of shifting shadows and desperate hopes. Now, the knowing was a different kind of agony, sharper, more defined, a brutal certainty that extinguished the last faint embers of a different outcome. Her sons had not simply vanished, they had been stolen, imprisoned, their spirits systematically broken, and then, ultimately, murdered by the man who played hymns of praise just a few feet above their subterranean prison. and he had not been alone. The image of the second robed figure, the one with the bird-like mask, haunted Sarah's waking hours and her dreams. Who was this overseer? Finch was dead, taking that secret with him, unless further investigation could somehow unmask this accomplice, this sharer in his monstrous sacred duty. The police redoubled their efforts, poring over old church records, parish council minutes, lists of significant donors or influential members from that era, looking for anyone who might fit the profile of Finch's overseer, anyone with a connection to him, anyone who might have shared his twisted ideology or had the influence to facilitate such a horrifying, long-term crime. The media descended again, the story of the church organ murders, a grim fascination. But for Sarah, the noise of the investigation, the speculation, the renewed public gaze, faded into a dull hum. Her focus was inward, on the memory of her boys, on the stolen years, on the unimaginable suffering they had endured. The discovery, while confirming their deaths, also brought a strange, terrible kind of intimacy. She had seen where they were held. She had seen their names scratched into the earth. She had seen the crude drawing of a sun, a pathetic, heartbreaking symbol of the light they had been denied. These fragments, these remnants of their captivity, were all that was left, and they were both precious and unbearable. She remembered you, Thomas, with your insatiable curiosity, always asking why, your brow furrowed in concentration over a puzzle or a book. And you, Arthur, my gentle artist, always with a crayon or a pencil in hand, your smiles so quick, your hugs so fierce. How could anyone extinguish such bright lights? How could evil flourish so profoundly in a place meant for solace and prayer? The town, too, struggled to reconcile the sanctity of St. Michael's with the horrors unearthed from its foundations. The church, its renovations now indefinitely halted, became a monument to a dark secret, its stones imbued with a sorrow that transcended time. Some called for its demolition, others for its reconsecration, a cleansing. The debate raged, another layer of pain for a community already grappling with a betrayed trust. Detective Miller, though tasked with pursuing the still unidentified accomplice, made it a point to keep Sarah informed, his quiet empathy a small solace. He told her about Finch's final paranoid entries, his fears of the structure becoming compromised, his obsession with eternal silence. It painted a picture of a man unraveling, perhaps under the weight of his crimes or perhaps because his overseer had withdrawn support, leaving Finch to face the potential exposure alone. The bird-masked figure remained a ghost. Despite extensive inquiries, no concrete leads emerged. They were a phantom from Finch's deranged world, their identity likely buried with him. It was a bitter pill, the knowledge that one of the architects of her son's suffering might still be out there, living an ordinary life, their monstrous secret intact. Yet, in the midst of this agonizing clarity, Sarah began to feel a subtle shift within herself. The relentless, gnawing question of, what if? That had plagued her for decades was finally answered, however brutally. The search was over. Not the search for justice, perhaps, for that felt elusive, incomplete with Finch dead and his accomplice unknown. But her personal search, the one that had consumed her life, had reached its terrible, inevitable end. Her boys were not lost somewhere, waiting. They were gone, victims of an evil she could barely comprehend. The photograph found in the organ, the one that had started this final painful chapter, now seemed like a message from them, a desperate cry across the years, leading her, finally, to the truth of their fate. The ink-blotted face of the first robed figure, Finch's own, was a symbol of his depravity. The bird-masked figure in the second photo, a symbol of the hidden, perhaps untouchable evil that had aided him. The weight of the revealed truth settled heavily upon Sarah, a suffocating blanket of grief, yet shot through with a strange, piercing clarity. The decades of uncertainty, of oscillating between fragile hope and despairing resignation had ended. In their place was a stark, cold knowledge. The full dimension of her son's suffering laid bare. Thomas and Arthur had not wandered off to the river. They had been methodically, cruelly ensnared by Alistair Finch, a man who cloaked his monstrous deeds in the guise of religious devotion, transforming the very heart of St. Michael's, its magnificent pipe organ, into an instrument of terror and a tomb. The journals, with their chillingly detached prose, painted a portrait of a meticulous predator, a man who orchestrated not only their captivity, but also the narrative of their disappearance. The neatly folded coats by the river, a deliberate, cynical piece of stagecraft, the convenient narrative, he had called it. The hidden chamber beneath the organ, their quiet room, was a place Sarah could scarcely bear to imagine, yet she forced herself to picture it, to honor their endurance, their small acts of defiance, their initials scratched into the damp earth, the poignant drawing of a sun. These were testaments to their spirit, unextinguished even in the face of such profound darkness. The second figure, the overseer in the bird-like mask, remained a chilling enigma, a loose thread in a tapestry of horror. Detective Miller assured her the investigation would remain open, that they would not cease looking for this accomplice, but Sarah understood the passage of time, the coldness of old trails. Finch was dead. The identity of his cohort might forever remain a secret locked away in the past. It was a deeply unsatisfying aspect of the resolution, a piece of the puzzle missing, a share of the guilt unassigned, unpunished in this world. Justice, in its fullest sense, felt unattainable. But closure, of a kind, had arrived. It was not the gentle, healing closure of fiction, but a raw, brutal slamming of a door that had been ajar for 39 years, letting in drafts of maddening possibility. Now, the door was shut, and on the other side lay the confirmed tragedy of her sons' stolen lives and terrible deaths. She found herself drawn back to the River Thorn, the place that had been the focal point of her grief for so long, the place the town had wrongly identified as the scene of their end. The water flowed on, indifferent and eternal, as it had that November day in 1984. But now, for Sarah, it was no longer a place of questioning, of imagining their small bodies lost beneath the current. It was just a river. Their coats, neatly folded, had been a lie, a cruel redirection. Finch's final letter, with its talk of silent conduits and joining the eternal choir, hinted that their remains might have eventually been consigned to water, perhaps through some hidden drainage system from the church, a final, perverted baptism. But the river itself was no longer their tomb. Their true tomb had been that earthen cell, and their spirits, she hoped, were finally free from it. The town of Ashworth was forever changed. St. Plashworth was forever changed. Michael's church stood silent, its renovations suspended, a gray monolith at the heart of the community, now a symbol of innocence betrayed and evil harbored. Discussions about its future were fraught and painful. Some wanted it torn down, every stone ground to dust. Others argued for its preservation, a solemn memorial, a place to remember and to warn. Sarah had no strong opinion on the church's fate. Her battle had been for the truth of her sons, not for the redemption or condemnation of a building. She had found them, in a way. She had found their story. The contents of the metal box from the chamber, the toy soldiers, the drawing, the photographs, Finch's letter, were eventually released to her. She held the small wooden soldiers, their paint chipped, their forms worn smooth, imagining Thomas's and Arthur's hands clutching them in the dark. The drawing of the sun, with its bright yellow crayon, was almost unbearable, a child's defiant hope against encroaching despair. These were her relics now, her sacred objects, tangible links to their lost years. The photograph from the organ, the one that had started it all, with Finch's face blacked out, she kept separate. It was a reminder of the facelessness of true evil, the void where compassion and humanity should reside. The organ itself, its pipes now silent and catalogued, its intricate mechanisms exposed, seemed like a metaphor for the investigation, a complex structure of secrets, finally dismantled to reveal the rotten core within. The pipes that weren't always used for music had indeed conducted something else entirely: suffering, despair, and ultimately, a pathway to a hidden, terrible truth. The days that followed the terrible confirmations settled into a new, somber rhythm for Sarah. The frenetic energy of the investigation, the public scrutiny, the raw shock of each discovery began to recede, leaving behind the deep, aching space of grief, a grief transformed. It was no longer the restless, questioning sorrow of the unknown, but the heavy, weary grief of irreversible loss, fully comprehended. The world, which had once felt like a place holding a terrible secret just out of reach, now felt like a place where that secret had been brutally revealed, its ugliness exposed to the light. There was a certain finality, a starkness that, in its own way, was less torturous than the decades of phantom hope and an invisible, ever-present question mark. Her small house, the one she had kept as a shrine to their arrested childhood, began to feel different. The unchanged bedroom, with its model airplanes and crayon drawings, had always been a place of waiting. Now, it was a place of remembrance, its objects imbued with a new, more profound sadness, but also with a sense of their story finally being told. She no longer expected them to walk through the door. She knew they couldn't. This knowing, as painful as it was, allowed for a different kind of connection, a memorializing of their reality, not just their absence. One afternoon she took the small, worn wooden toy soldiers and the crayon drawing of the sun, placing them in a simple wooden box alongside a few cherished photographs from their early childhood, the boys beaming, gap-toothed, on a seaside holiday, their small faces serious as they held her hands on their first day of school. These were the markers of their life, not just their death. The community, deeply scarred, began its own slow process of healing, or at least, of attempting to understand how such darkness could have festered unseen in their midst for so long. St. Michael's Church remained a contentious issue. Ultimately, it was decided that the main structure would be preserved, but the section above the hidden chamber, the area where the organ once stood, would be transformed into a simple memorial garden, a place of quiet contemplation dedicated to Thomas and Arthur Finch and to all children lost to violence. The organ pipes, those silent witnesses, were never reassembled. Some were melted down, others given to museums of musical history, their association with Finch's crimes a permanent, dark footnote. Sarah attended the dedication of the memorial garden. It was a gray, wind-swept day, much like that November day so long ago. Standing there, amidst the hushed crowd, she felt a profound sense of exhaustion, but also a flicker of something else, not peace, perhaps not yet, but a sense of an ending. Her sons' names were spoken aloud, their memory honored, the truth of their fate acknowledged. The overseer, the bird-masked figure from the second photograph, was never identified. That part of the story remained an open wound, a chilling reminder that not all shadows can be brought into the light, that some evil escapes earthly justice. But Finch, the primary architect of their suffering, was gone, his secrets unearthed from the very instrument he had used to project an image of piety. His journals, locked away as evidence, were a testament to his deranged conviction and his ultimate pathetic downfall. Sarah knew her life would never be free from the shadow of what had happened. The loss of Thomas and Arthur was a part of her, woven into the fabric of her being. But the nature of that shadow had changed. It was no longer the shapeless, terrifying specter of the unknown. It was the defined, understood shadow of a tragedy faced, a truth unearthed. She had fought for them, for their story, for nearly 4 decades. And in the end, in the most heartbreaking way imaginable, she had found them. The photograph from the organ, that initial, shocking catalyst, now rested in the box with their other belongings. It was a testament to their survival, however brief, beyond the lie of the river, and a key that had unlocked a hidden, terrible history. The ink-blotted face of Alistair Finch was a permanent fixture in her mind, a symbol of the darkness that could lie beneath the most ordinary, even sanctified surfaces. The music of St. Michael's was silenced, but the truth, in its sorrowful, complex way, had finally, painstakingly, been brought forth. The final echoes of the discovery began to fade from the public consciousness, as new tragedies and dramas captured the fleeting attention of the world. But for Sarah, and for the town of Ashworth, the resonance of Alistair Finch's crimes and the lost lives of Thomas and Arthur would linger indefinitely, a deep, sorrowful chord struck in the heart of their shared history. St. Michael's Memorial Garden, where the great organ once stood, became a quiet place. Sarah visited it sometimes, not with the frantic searching of her past, but with a somber acceptance. She would sit on one of the simple stone benches, the wind whispering through the newly planted shrubs, and remember her boys, not as the haunted faces in Finch's cruel photographs, but as the vibrant, laughing children they had been. Their light, though brutally extinguished, had, in its own way, illuminated a profound darkness, forcing a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about the capacity for evil to hide in plain sight, even within the supposed sanctuary of faith. The police file on the overseer remained open, a slim folder in a cold case cabinet, a testament to the frustrating limits of investigation when faced with a cunning, long-dead perpetrator and the erosion of time. Detective Miller, now graying at the temples, would occasionally call Sarah, a quiet check-in, a shared understanding passing between them. He knew, as she did, that some questions might never be answered, some culprits never unmasked. But the central mystery, the fate of Thomas and Arthur, had been solved, its narrative pieced together from dust, faded ink, and the silent testimony of a hidden chamber. The horror of their captivity, the sheer, calculated cruelty of Alistair Finch, was a burden Sarah would carry always. Yet, in carrying it with the full weight of knowledge, she found a different strength than she had possessed in the decades of uncertainty. There was a grim resilience in knowing the worst, in having looked into the abyss and survived. The photograph from the organ, that single faded Polaroid, had been a terrible gift. It had ripped open old wounds, inflicted new ones, but it had also, finally, pierced the veil of lies and misdirection that Finch had so carefully constructed. It had given her sons back their true story, however tragic. It had forced the truth from the silent pipes and hidden compartments of a monstrous deception. The narrative of the neatly folded coats by the river was replaced by the far more complex and horrifying reality of their abduction, their imprisonment, and their murder. The convenient narrative had been exposed for the calculated cruelty it was. Sarah thought of Finch's last journal entry. The silence must be absolute. The pipes will hold their secrets eternally. They will never know the true harmony. He had been wrong. The silence had been broken. The pipes had yielded their secrets. And while there was no harmony in the truth they revealed, there was a terrible, resonant clarity. The world was not made right. Her sons were not returned. But the not knowing, that corrosive acid that had eaten away at her for so long, was gone. In its place was the profound, enduring ache of loss, but a loss she could now mourn fully, without the maddening torment of unanswered questions. She had walked through the fire of discovery, and though scarred, she had emerged, carrying the memory of Thomas and Arthur not as vanished phantoms, but as beloved children whose tragic story was, at last, fully known. The church organ was silent forever, its music replaced by the indelible, sorrowful truth it had concealed for too long.